Hey guys, it's Camus, and welcome to another edition of Coffeehouse Chess Openings. Today we're going to look at the Nymphomaniac Attack. This is actually a variation of the Caro-Kann, and it was named the Nymphomaniac Attack by National Master Jack Young, who, together with Brian Wall, have developed the theory such as it is on this opening. So it begins 1e4, c6, knight to f3, d5. And now the normal move here in Caro-Kann theory is knight to c3, leading into the two knights variation. The two knights variation, incidentally, has a couple of wicked traps in it as well, but we're not looking at those today. We're going to look at the move e5. And this move has hardly been played in chess history. In fact, there's only two games in my chess-based megabase, one white win and one a white loss. The white win is from Kevin Spraggett, who is the originator of this line. He first played this in 1976 in the Montreal Open and won a very quick game indeed. So this line has good pedigree. The video is going to be divided into three parts. The first part will be looking at the variations after bishop to g4, which are considered to be the main line. The second part will be on bishop f5, which is the second most popular line, and white has a lot of interesting play in this line as well too. And then thirdly, we'll look at other variations and transpositions to give you the information necessary to play this in your own games. So anyway, we'll get started right away with the meat of it and the bishop to g4 variation. Okay, so bishop to g4 is probably the move that you're going to see the most. And you should reply d4. And now, the most common is e6. We'll go look at the other moves in a minute. And then c3. It's all as regular Caro-Kann play. Now, black quite often here or at another point will soon play c5. And this activates our trap. c5, and we take this pawn. Now the natural inclination is for black to recapture, but he does so at his peril. Bishop takes c5, loses immediately to queen to a4 check. And a number of strong players have fallen into this at this point, Grandmaster Eric Lobrun being one of the most prominent. So if your opponent doesn't give up right away, there's some further play here. So a lot of people will just resign on the spot. Knight to c6, and then of course we're taking off the bishop on g4. So let's assume that he plays knight g to e7, and now there's a chance for black to go wrong a second time. After bishop to d3, he can play queen to b6, seems logical, and castles, and say he plays g6 at this point. Now you can play b4, and we've trapped a second bishop. And it's possible to get this bishop trap in a number of other variations. So keep that tactical motif in the back of your mind. And at this point, everyone will resign. Okay, after the loss of two bishops, too much to bear. Okay, let's go back and look at some other possible lines here. Instead of taking c5, some of your opponents will see the trap on g4, but that doesn't mean they're out of the woods, because it is still possible to fall into a second trap. Say they play something like knight to c6. Then we play bishop to b5. And now, if they don't play bishop takes f3, which is what they should play, and they get an equal position, if they take the pawn now, then they're sunk. After bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and now queen to a4, we're hitting both the bishop and the pawn on c6. The normal response is to play bishop takes f3, but it doesn't work out, because after queen to c6 check, black can either play king to f8, in which case we take the other bishop with check, and then we're going to pick up the bishop on f3, or He plays queen to d7, in which case we take the rook with check, king to e7, then we take the bishop on f3. In either case, black is completely sunk. Incidentally, this last variation caught Grandmaster Danielson, I believe he's Icelandic, in 2009. This is another one of Brian Wall's games, and Brian is credited with discovering the second hidden trap in the line. So, let's go back and look at some of the other options. Okay, he can play from this position. We have just taken the pawn on c5. He can play knight to d7. But after b4, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, knight takes e5, queen to g3, knight to c6, bishop to d3, a5, b5, knight c to e7, b6, knight to c6, bishop to e3, knight to f6. White has an advantage. Having looked at some of the trappy variations in the bishop to g4 line, let's look at some other possibilities, as not everyone will stumble into the elephant trap there. If black really wants to play this c5 idea, and he probably should with this pawn structure, a better way to do it is to play knight to d7, and then white can play either knight b to d2 or to h3. Let's look at both of them quickly. Knight b to d2, c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. And now after queen to a4, our trap no longer works because it's not check. So black can play bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, and then a likely course of play would be something like knight to e7, bishop to f4, castles, bishop to d3, knight to g6, bishop to g3, bishop to e7, bishop to c2, queen to c7, queen to d4, and then after bishop to c5, queen to d3. Now black cannot take this pawn. Knight d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5 because of queen to h7 checkmate. So he won't do that. He should play queen to b6, castles, and this is just an equal position. And white is doing fine here. Let's go back. White can also play h3 from this position. This is after c3, black plays knight d7. h3 is possible. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen to b6, b4. Now black thinks he's winning something here. He sees a tactic, but the tactic doesn't work. Bishop takes b4, c takes b4, and now in the game, black made a big mistake by taking on b4 check. But after queen to c3, I guess it's a move he overlooked. Queen to b6, bishop to a3, knight to h6, knight to d2, knight to f5, knight to f3. He's just simply losing. He's down a piece for very little compensation. What he should have done instead of taking on b4, is taken on queen to d4, queen to c3, queen takes e5, queen takes e5, knight takes e5, knight to d2. And black has 3 pawns for the piece, although Rybka thinks that white is better in this position. But these black central pawns could be an issue later in the game, so it's not all cut and dried. Let's go back some more. Now, this is the position after c3. We just looked at the variations with knight to d7. Another line of play that black might try is queen to b6. After bishop to d3, c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. And now queen to a4 check is winning the bishop, although we do have a slight issue on f2. In this position, Joe Ford against international master Coffeehouse. Ford was afraid of the 200-point rating difference and offered a draw, which the international master accepted. However, Rybka is of the opinion that white is totally winning. Now let's look at a couple of lines earlier on here. This is the position after bishop to g4, d4. We looked at positions that occur after e6, but black can play bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, And white has no problems here. He's got the two bishops and some extra space, and there should be no problems at all. He can also, from this position, after d4, play knight to d7. White will play bishop to d3, c5, c3, e6, castles, knight to e7, bishop to e3, queen to b6, knight b to d2, ignoring the threat of queen takes b2. The reason for that is if queen takes b2, rook to b1, queen takes a2, and now, good move, queen to c1. We're threatening to trap the queen because, say he did something silly, like knight to g6, then rook to a1 picks up the queen. So he wouldn't do that. He's going to have to extract himself by queen to a5. White plays rook to b7. We've gotten back one of our pawns. Rook to b8, rook takes rook, knight takes rook, d takes c5. And we've gotten back our other pawn. Bishop takes f3, knight takes f3. And white is better here. In fact, Rybka seems to think that white has a significant advantage. But white will have to keep an eye on this a pawn, and his own pawn structure is a little bit shaky. But all in all, this looks very good for white. Okay, we will now go on and take a look at the bishop to f5 variations. Okay, let's look at bishop f5. This is, as I said, the second most common continuation you're likely to meet. And white has a lot of interesting play here. After knight to h4, black has a number of responses. We'll look at the first one, queen to d7. This is not very good. Knight takes f5, queen takes f5, d4, and now if black is not paying attention and plays e6, bishop to d3 picks up the queen. And that's all she wrote in that line. So instead of e6, queen to e4, bishop to e3, queen to g6, knight to c3, and white is just much better in this position. The black queen's done a lot of running around, and we've got some extra space, two bishops, and we're ahead in development. After knight to h4, another response is bishop to g6. This is the most common response, but it's not a good one. We played knight takes g6. Black invariably takes with the h pawn to open up scope for his rook. H takes g6. And now white has a very interesting move here, e6. I'm not sure who's responsible for this move. I believe it's Jack Young, although I did see Eric Schiller has analyzed some of these lines too. This is a very enterprising move that may or may not lose a pawn for white. If white loses the pawn, he usually gets full compensation for it. So there's a number of replies here. Most common is probably f takes e6. Then after d4, well, he could play knight to f6. After bishop to d3, well, he wouldn't want to play knight b to d7 as occurred in a game of Brian Walls because bishop takes g6 is checkmate. Instead, he'll play something like queen to c7. Then after bishop takes g6 check, king to d7. And there's a whole range of replies that white can play here. G3, H3, knight to D2, H4, F4, queen to E2 are all good moves. Probably the best two moves are knight to D2 and G3. Let's just take a look at G3. Knight to A6, and of course this move G3 threatens bishop to F4, but white probably best to castle right now. Rook to D8, knight to D2, king to C8, knight to F3, knight to G4, and several moves have been played in this position too, all of which win for white. Bishop to F7, bishop to F4, knight to G5, queen to E2, rook to E1, H4. These are all winning attempts. Rybka's favorite line is bishop to F7, which I think is best. Rook to D6 to try and hang on to the pawn, but overlooking bishop to F4, which is a shish kebab. And now black will have to play something like king to b8, bishop to e6, knight to f6, rook to e1, and this is just winning. Let's go back. Okay, this is the position after f takes e6 and d4. We just looked at variations with knight to f6. A better line for black is queen to d6. White follows up with queen to g4, knight to d7, queen takes g6 check, king to d8, bishop to e3. And now probably best for black is e5 with an equal position. After something like queen to d6, e takes d6, knight to d2, king to c7, castles queenside, knight g to f6, bishop to e2, and Rybka assesses this is dead equal. Say both sides have chances here. Instead, black may be tempted to take a pawn off on h2, but this is ill-advised. If he plays rook takes h2, rook takes h2, queen takes h2, queen takes e6, and white is just simply better here. Okay, returning to the position after e6. A better try for black, rather than f takes e6, which is what we just looked at, is f5. And now, the natural move d4 is probably not good, because black is going to play knight to f6, and that knight is headed for e4. So we want to reserve the d pawn to come to d3. So best in this position, rather than d4, is queen to e2. This also helps shore up our e pawn. And now black has a couple of moves here. We'll look at knight to f6, d3, as mentioned before, c5, knight to d2, knight to c6, c3, d4, g3, knight to d5, c4, knight d to b4, rook to b1. A strange looking move, but if black takes the a pawn, knight takes a2, after bishop to g2, queen to d6, knight to f3, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, rook to h5, h4, castles queenside, knight to g5, rook to e8, bishop to f3, rook takes g5, h takes g5. This is Rybka's analysis, and white seems to be better in this position. Let's go back. Instead of knight to f6, probably a better reply for black, and perhaps the best reply is queen to d6, g3, and now try knight to f6, d3, knight to a6, bishop to f4, and white is better. He's going to play c3, knight d2 to f3, knight to g5, castles, and perhaps h4 with a lock on the king side. And black has serious development issues. One thing that's notable in all these lines, in the bishop f5 variation, is how often the black bishop at f8 gets totally locked out of play for some time. And this gives white an advantage in several lines. Let's go back. Instead of knight to f6, this is after g3, you play knight to a6. The idea of this is to try and round up the e pawn after knight to e7. But we can play d4 or d3 here. Let's look at d3. Now if he plays knight to c7, he's not going to be winning the pawn back after bishop to f4, because he can't play queen takes e6 here, because we just simply win the knight on c7. So instead, he needs to play queen to b4 check, c3. You can't take the b pawn because it's now defended by the queen, queen to b6, and Rybka believes that white is much better in this position. One more time, after queen to e2, instead of queen to d6, you can also try knight to a6. Similar idea. d3, queen to c7, g3, knight to f6, and now bishop to f4 is playable, but probably stronger is knight to d2, with the idea of knight to f3 going to g5, and that's going to be a problem for black. Okay, so this is a position again after e6. We just looked at lines with f5. Black can also play queen to d6. This isn't very good after e takes f7, king takes f7. And white can play g3 or h3. But let's look at d4. And once again, this h-pawn, which appears to be hanging, is not really good for black to take. Rook takes h2, rook takes h2, queen takes h2, knight to d2, knight to f6, knight to f3, and if he goes to h5, then we play knight to e5 check, king to g8, g4, queen to h1, queen to e2, knight to a6, knight takes g6, knight to e4, bishop to d2, knight to c7, castles queenside, and Rybka believes that white has a very large advantage in this position. So let's go back. Instead of queen to h5 after knight to f3, you can play queen to c7. And now knight to e5 has been played, but it looks like knight to g5 is stronger. Knight to g5 check, king to g8, queen to e2, queen to d7, g3. This has a nasty threat of bishop to h3, king to h8, bishop to h3 anyway, queen to c7, knight to e6, this can't be good, queen to c8, bishop to f4, knight to h5, castles queenside, knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, queen to e8, bishop to e6, and white is winning here because the threat of rook to h1, checkmate, is unstoppable. Finally, we'll look at knight to f6, but after e takes f7, king takes f7, white has two bishops and a safer king, and it's got a small edge, mainly due to that lockdown bishop that we mentioned before on f8. In this position, besides d4, h3 and bishop e2 may also be playable. d4, knight b to d7, and now not bishop to d3, which is playable and natural, but f4, this is preventing e5, e6, knight to d2, bishop to d6, knight to f3, c5, and white has a couple of good moves here, bishop to d3, knight to g5 check, c3. Let's follow a game of Brian Walsh. He played c3, but he also agrees that bishop to d3 and knight g5 are sharper, but nothing wrong with c3. c3 in the game, queen to e7 was played, bishop to d3, knight to e4, bishop takes e4, d takes e4, now knight to g5 check, king to g8, knight takes e4, c takes d4, and now he could have played queen to takes d4 with a significant advantage. In the game he played castles, bishop to c7, c takes d4, bishop to b6, bishop to e3, knight to f6, queen to f3, rook to d8, rook a to d1, knight to d5, knight to c5, king to f7, strange move, bishop to f2, leaves white with a completely winning position here. In the game, I believe he played the mistake g3, and his opponent should have played knight takes e3, but as so often is the case, one blunder follows another. He played queen to f6, and now knight to e4, and white has a winning advantage here. He didn't play that. He played rook f to e1, and now bishop to c5, d takes c5, knight takes e3, queen takes e3, rook takes d1, rook takes d1, rook to e8, rook to d7 check, king to g8. I think he played queen to e5, rook to takes b7 is probably a little bit better, queen to e5, rook to c8, b4, a5, a3, a takes b4, a takes b4, rook to a8, queen takes f6, g takes f6, rook takes b7, rook to a2, c6, and he resigned. This was the game Brian Wall playing a guy named Flammer Rouge, who was an expert rated 2086. This was played in 2011. Okay, well I hope we've given you some flavor of the lines after bishop f5, but in all cases it seems that white gets interesting play, and the best that black can achieve is equality in one or two of the lines. We'll go on and look at some odds and ends before we conclude the video. And now I'd like to conclude the video with just a little bit more information for those of you who might be considering adding this to your repertoire. We'll just look at a few of the early moves after we've played 3e5. As I mentioned, e5 is not a bad move, although it seems to be very rare in the Caro-Kann. So let's look at some other possibilities here. Instead of bishop f5 and bishop to g4, which we've already looked at, which will constitute most of the games, there are a few more possibilities, such as e6. But this is just a French defense where black has lost a tempo, because after we play d4, if you play c5, he's got to that move in 2 tempi instead of 1. So, as I said before, if you're playing 1e4, I'm sure you have something prepared against the French defense, and this shall provide no problem to you. Okay, so another possibility is c5. But if we just continue d4 and say black responds knight c6, c3, we're just inviting this bishop to g4 move, because now we're back into our main line and we can transpose. You can either play bishop to b5 here or d takes c5, and there's both transpose into lines that we've already looked at. So no dangers there. Finally, the only line that seems to be of any independent significance after e5 is d4, and after bishop to c4, then black has two choices. He can play e6, seems sensible. White is already a little better in this position. Castles, c5, d3, knight to e7, c3, knight to b6, queen to e2, knight to g6 is a likely line of play, and here white has an edge, at least according to Rybka. It looks like he can hang on to his e-pawn for the time being. And so anyway, no worries in this line. And finally, instead of e6 after bishop to c4, he can attempt to trap the bishop a la the Noah's Ark trap with b5. Bishop to b3, now c5 is the consistent follow-up. But white has got knight to g5 here, and two choices for black. He can play the more sensible e6. However, after knight takes f7, king takes f7, queen to f3 check, king to e8, we're picking up the rook on a8. So black may play queen to c7, attempting to trap the white queen, but queen to e4. After bishop to b7, the queen drops back to e2. And now black can pick up this bishop on b3, but no worries. c4, castle. Rybka thinks that d3 is the best move here. C takes d3, c takes b3, a takes b3, knight to c6, and we reach a situation where white has two pawns and a rook for two pieces. Black has a better pawn structure, white's got the safer king. To say chances are about equal, but not to be biased or anything, but I'd probably rather play white in this position just due to the fact that the black king cannot castle. It looks rather exposed. Okay, and one more line to look at. Instead of e6 in this line after knight to g5, he can attempt to play c4, but this doesn't work out. After queen to f3, and white is just simply winning the rook here, and black gets very little compensation for it. Well, it gets the bishop, but still, this is much better, and Rybka assesses this as totally winning for white. I mean, not only are we attacking the rook, but we're also threatening queen to f7 or knight takes f7. All good lines for us. Okay, well, I hope you got something out of this video. As I said, it was not a true Coffeehouse opening insofar as the fact that it seems to be utterly sound, and you can play this at slow tournament time controls. At fast time controls, then it does become a Coffeehouse opening, because these traps, particularly in the bishop to g4 line, are difficult to spot, and it's actually crazy the number of IMs and GMs that have fallen straight into it. So if strong titled players are falling for these traps, it's a good bet that your opponents, no matter what their strength, are going to fall for it too.